Let's take a look at a couple more action attributes. The first one is data row, where you're allowed to create sets of data to pass to a test. So we could create a data row 1, 1, data row 2, 2. So what's inside of the parentheses, you can have as many arguments as you want and as whatever data type you want. And then what happens is it passes it to the method over which these things decorate. So the 1 and the 1 would be passed to the num1 and the num2, and the 2 and then the 2 would next be passed to that each time it executes that specific test. Now there's also a deployment item attribute where you add a file name to an attribute. So you call it deployment item and then pass in a file name. What you need to do is then add that file.txt to the test project, and then it copies that file to the deployment directory prior to the test running. All right, so we're going to use these two things hand in hand. So let's take a look at the data row attribute and the deployment item attribute. In the file process test class, I've added a new test method that you can see on lines 63 through 69. The method is called rNumbersEqual, and it accepts two parameters. Now, notice the data row that I have, 1, 1, display name first test 1, 1, and then another data row attribute, 42, 42, display name is second test. What happens is the first data row's data gets taken, those two parameters, 1 and a 1, and it gets passed and mapped to those two parameters in the rNumbersEqual. We then do an assert.equal on that. Then the second data row passes its values to this test, 42 and a 42, and an assert.equal is also run. Now the display name property shows up in the test run results, and it's really nice. Let's take a look. So we'll go ahead and run all results here. And when we look at this, we can see down here that first test 1, 1. So you know that that's the one that passed with that set of data in that data row. So that's why it's important to set that display name so it'll show up here, and you can then get a good look at which test succeeds, and if one were to fail, you would know which one fails. Let's now take a look at using the data row in combination with the deployment item attribute. Now, a deployment item attribute allows us to say, I've got a file in my project that I want to deploy to the deployment directory of our tests. So what we have to do is we have to add a new item, go to General, find the text file, and I'm going to create file to deploy.txt, and I'm just going to add something in here, and we'll save that. Now, in order to get this to deploy to the runtime of the tests, what we first have to do is make sure that we bring up the properties window here, and we set the copy to output directory as copy always. This then makes sure that this file to deploy gets copied to the bin folder so that the test framework can pick it up and put it into the deployment directory of the unit tests. Then what we'll do here is we will add in a new test method, and what this test method does is it has a deployment item on line 72, file to deploy.txt. That's the file that we just added. On line 73, I've got a data row which uses our hard-coded version of C:\Windows regedit.exe. Notice the display name. I then have another data row which is file to deploy.txt. And again, we have a display name set up for that as well. Now what happens then again is the deployment item is going to say, okay, go find the file to deploy, put it into the deployment directory of our tests. Then it passes the first file name to our file name using data row method, and we go through our normal process. Now, we're going to create the file process FP variable. Then we're going to check to make sure that the file name does not contain a backslash. Now, the first time through it will, so it skips the if statement, simply goes ahead, checks the file, does a file exists on that file name, and then assert.isTrue. The next time through, we pass in file to deploy.txt into the file name. This time the file name does not contain a backslash, so we're going to assume that that is our deployment item. Then on line 81, we say file name equal testcontext.deployment directory. So the test context hold the directory where our files will be deployed. We can add on a backslash and the file name. Now we can check to see if that file exists. Let's take a look. Run all the tests. We find our new method name, file name using data row. We come down and we find our two values, regedit, and our deployment item here, which if we open this up, you can see that that is the location of where these files are deployed to.